welcome to episode 148 of the PowerScore LSAT podcast. This is Jon Denning in Los Angeles.
And this is Dave Kaloran in Napa Valley.
I miss it up there, man. Just left you yesterday.
Yeah, you were here for, I don't know, five days?
Yeah, I was. We got a surprising amount of work done for the number of distractions that your town provides.
I'm not distracted. You were distracted. And it wasn't the town providing the distractions.
Name redacted.
Most definitely.
I told you, I just texted her. I was like, I'm home. I can finally start my dry February.
On the 29th.
On the 29th.
And it's only dry February once every 4 years for you on the last day of the month, right? It's just the 29th?
It's only dry anything once every 4 years. But that does influence the first question I'm going to ask you, which is, what are you drinking?
That's an easy one. Water.
Yeah. I've got a sugar-free Red Bull, but yeah, I'm on a full detox from you.
Yeah, it's also a little early in the day to be drinking wine.
That is true.
In fact, the reason you came up was that a mutual friend of ours is a national sales director for a big wine brand up here, and he had a huge tasting. So that's what kind of kicked off the whole weekend. It was fun.
Yeah. It was a week of huge tastings. It was great.
Yeah.
You picked a song for today, so you're going to have to tell it.
Well, we're going to talk about the release of all the new prep materials from LSAC. And so had to go with a song about something new. This is a big change, obviously. The kind of like the ground rules have changed on this test with no more logic games, and that's what they've released. So I went with a pretty popular song by, I think, a really cool artist, and that's Dua Lipa. The song is New Rules.
When you say pretty popular, give me one statistic.
I think this video has over 3 billion views.
That was the statistic. That's insane.
That's popularity.
Yeah.
Full credit. She's cool. Anyway, let's jump right into it.
Cool.
Obviously, the LSAT world just had score release roll through. I don't think the February LSAT was the best LSAT in the world for producing high scores.
Yeah.
Some LSATs, I think we see, have a lot of people calling in and writing us and messaging us saying, hey, I just blew past my personal best. I've done better than on any prior test. I saw one or two of those, but I didn't see as many as I have on some tests. And I think maybe LSAC is attempting to reset the scale a little bit, or at least the percentiles, because the percentiles are on an upward creep that I don't like.
I completely agree with you. I saw a lot of posts, various places, about score drops. And I know that you and I both got a little bit of grief when we did our recap of February and our scale predictions, because people were like, that's too tight, your predictions, the test was harder than that. I feel a little validated in a way that I hoped not to.
Yeah. It wasn't just, what we saw either. I talked to a few other people who do LSAT work on the regular, and they had similar experiences with what they saw. And it isn't to say that we didn't see high scores. We saw high scores, but some tests you can feel like, I remember when the score bubble was happening, I could tell. I was like, what's going on? There's so many people just destroying their top scores, getting in the 170s. This felt like a return to a ways back, where it's like, certainly you have scores in the 170s, but it wasn't like a tidal wave, which, is less fun.
Frankly, it is less fun. The score bubble, for the people who got to experience it, was wonderful because it was, a bubble. But in hindsight, I think they had miscalibrated, and we're starting to see that adjustment.
Yeah, that is exactly the case. So one of the things I saw coming out of this was a lot of people who were looking to, retake April, which I think the registration deadline might be today.
It is tonight.
Yeah, it's tonight. And so that means by the time this comes out, most likely, I don't think this is going to be released on Thursday. It'll probably be released on Friday. That will have closed. But if you're taking April or June and you're a retaker, or if you're just a new taker, always remember that one of the things we have rolling around are the free seminars that we do. And there are several of them, certainly on the LSAT side with just the testing. In the middle of March, we're going to do an LR Common Flaws webinar. We're going to do one on April 2nd about the LSAT 101 for the new LSAT, another one on April 16th. It's an RC skills test. And then there is another one floating around out there, John, that I can't remember the date or even what the topic is. Maybe you do.
I'll do my best. I believe it's on March 6th. I believe you and I are both on the hook for it. And it's our crystal ball for the April and the June LSATs, although I think we're probably going to squeeze in a mini ball at some point in May. We'll see. We'll see what happens in April before we make that call. But it feels like the end of an era, in a way. This is the last one where we get to play games about logic game predictions.
Yeah, no more predictions after these two tests come through.
Yeah.
And that's unfortunate. That means no more specialized problem sets. I love choosing the logic games problem sets based upon, what we think is coming down the pipeline. So I suppose that makes our life a little bit easier after the April and June tests. But keep in mind, if you are an LSAT taker who's good at logic games, or you feel like you can become good at them, which is what a lot of people feel like, April and June are your last two shots to do that and take a test with logic games. And somebody I saw on Reddit had asked the question, like, what do I do this logic games Bible after June? And I was like, I hate to say this, but it doesn't have much value after June. We're going to not publish it anymore because there won't be logic games on the test. So this is your last two shots if logic games is something that you have at all an affinity for.
Yeah. As someone who's kind of a puzzle nerd, I think it has inherent value. Just because to me it's fun to try to crack these little riddles. But in terms of applicability, it's done.
It is done, and I doubt we'll ever see any more released logic games come out either. They'll probably just put them in a vault and keep them away. But if you want to attend that crystal ball, and honestly, if you look at the comments from students who've attended in the past, I would strongly recommend that you do so. You can go to powerscore.com/free seminars and sign up for free there. It'll be free that evening. We'll maybe release it thereafter, free to the public. I don't know what the story is.
I was just about to ask you that exact question.
No one's actually asked me about it previously, so I don't have an answer. But I always say this. You can guarantee that for one night only, it is going to be free. Whether or not it is released free after that is sometimes up for debate. We'll have to see, but it will be free on March 6th at 5 p.m. Pacific, 8 p.m. Eastern time. So come join us. And if you're thinking about taking one of these LSATs or a future LSAT, I will mention that we have a 20% off course sale going on through March 15th. So you have about 2 weeks to sign up and get that 20%. Usually when they have a deadline on it, things run out. So I would expect that would go away after March 15th.
Yeah, I think so too. All right, let's talk about the future. Let's talk about these new tests that have just been released.
It's both the future and the past since they just released it.
True that. And also the past, because what they've released is actually just a compilation of past tests.
Yeah, they're going through a weird period right now, and I have some sympathy for them. They know logic games is going away. They have all these tests, literally PT 1 through 94, plus a few other varied, super prep and random Feb 97 tests that are floating around out there that all have logic games. So they have a problem because it's like, we want to release these new tests and we don't want them to have logic games.
Right.
It's also a slightly different format because it's only 3 scored sections instead of 4 like the last. So what they did was they came out and they released what they call 58 new prep tests. And they didn't number them 1 through 58. They started a whole new numbering system. So now they're numbered 101 to 158.
Your inflection on the word new there cracked me up a little bit.
Quote unquote new. We'll get into what's actually going on with that. But you will start to see these prep tests 101 through 158. Obviously, everybody's adding them to their system right now. But John, what's the basic reason they did that?
Well, when you lose logic games, basically every prep test in existence is no longer valid, or at least no longer relevant. So they had to reconfigure things. The significance of that, to me, interestingly enough, starting in August 2024, is you now have this runway of about 5.5 months to prepare with content that's reflective of what you're going to see starting this August. And I think that's important. I'm glad that they kind of got out ahead of it this far.
They're giving people who are taking August or later specific study material that matches exactly what their test format is going to be.
Yeah.
And you have to realize that the PT 1 through 94, they're going to, persist for a while. but eventually LSAC's going to remove those tests. Somebody who shows up in, say, 2025, they don't need to know about PT 47 because it has logic games on it. In fact, they won't want them to see it. So at some point, they will pull the access on their system from those. But the interesting thing is I was thinking we're going to get some new content.
I was hoping so too.
That is not what they did. What they chose to do was to take those prior 94 exams, and we'll talk a little bit about what they've done, and they reshuffled them. So
that's a good way to put it.
It's exactly what they did. And then they recompiled them. So they removed the logic games on every one of those. And many of them, not all, but many of them already had 2 LRs and an RC because they were from the old kind of like 4-scored section days. And then they took some LSATs and they said, all right, you know what we're going to do? We're going to cut you up and use you as experimentals.
Yeah.
So every one of these tests now has an experimental, either LR or RC, and that is from a formerly released test. So you go in there and you might say to yourself, what am I actually looking at? And as it breaks down, let's say you've got like prep test we'll use 154.
Okay.
And that is PT 88, the current PT 88 that's kind of floating around there. And they use PT 82, one of the LR sections from that, as the experimental. Or you go to what's the new PT 158, that is prep test 90 from the old days. And they used an LR from prep test 91 that they tossed in there. So they've done this reshuffling where it's essentially all formerly released material, but now shuffled, and then the logic games removal has been compensated for by stealing LR and RC from other tests.
Yeah. It shuffle, I think, is a perfect verb here, because to me it feels like a deck of cards. It feels like we've lost the diamonds and gained an extra set of hearts or something. That's kind of how they've done this. But they've pulled from other decks, and that's what you're going to get. There's a downside to this, obviously, which is it's a little tricky for the average person out there taking these tests to track what came from where. Have I seen this before? Am I familiar with this? I don't love that.
No, it's a huge pain. And one of the things I will say is that every one of these tests has an experimental. That experimental is a formerly released test. So it's completely viable. But you ask about the tracking thing. I was talking to Grant Blake of Reddit, and he was like, this sucks because you have PT 1 through 94. Everybody knows where to find explanations. It's easy to search in the forum. Now something that was PT 80 is now PT 155 or 6 or whatever it is. And it's going to be really hard to find for a while. And, he's exactly right about that. We've been facing that with our forum. We can find PT 1 through 94, but now we have to append these new numbers to each of the sections. It's just more work, but it is actually not easy or fast work. It is going to take time.
Yeah. This has also been what I've always found to be a very valid complaint about Khan Academy, that they don't specify exactly where their practice stuff comes from. And so you just kind of never know if you've seen this question, this section, this test before. And it's sloppy, it's messy. And for a lot of people, it's very aggravating, and I get it.
Well, that's actually, apropos that you bring up Khan Academy, because as far as LSAT prep, my understanding is that when they hit June, they lose their official designation as an LSAC partner.
Oh.
And I believe they're shutting that down. So if you're in the Khan Academy course, I don't know if it'll persist after June, but certainly LSAC has said that they're going to take some of the content and put it on LawHub. I believe they're removing their free test access because, of course, it's built on old tests. Right. Now there's new tests and all the logic game stuff goes away. So I don't really pay a whole lot of attention to Khan Academy because I think that the free tests are fantastic. And I always advocate that people use those, but I'm not a fan of the instruction or the lack thereof. It's mostly a lot of explanations. So I'm not dying over the fact that it's, perhaps going the way of the,
what animal you gonna pick? Yeah, I knew it.
I was trying to think of something that was PG rated.
That's pretty PG, except for what we did to them. The largest member of the pigeon family. There's your dodo fact of the day. Subscribe for more. What I was going to say, my temptation was going to be good riddance, but you and I are both such big proponents of free content that it's hard for me to have, I don't know, I have a very mixed take on Khan Academy, and a lot of the positives of the fact that I agree with you. I'm glad that there's free content out there for people. Certainly you and I try to provide as much as possible too.
Yeah. I think hopefully LSAC will add a few more free tests to the LawHub free version. But I also think at the same time, the LawHub Advantage is such a good deal compared to what you had to pay in the past. I mean, these days, I don't think a lot of students realize that when you're paying the fee to them for access to all the LSATs, that used to cost much more on a relative basis 5-10 years ago. We should go buy paper tests that were like $8 each. It just added up tremendously. So it's a much better deal now, even though it's still not inexpensive. But I'm hoping maybe they'll add a few more free ones. But if not, the LawHub Advantage is one of the best deals out there in terms of getting free.
Let's talk about what's available to add, because it doesn't include everything they could. For instance, it's missing PTs 1 through 18. I think it's missing 21 and 23.
That is correct.
Yeah, 20 tests that aren't included. And look, there's still 58, so that's pretty great, but there are more that they could provide. I don't know why they won't.
It's been that way though, John. If you think about it, the early PTs, that particular grouping, I think I've said before, I don't think they digitized them.
Oh.
So they don't have them in working perfect format because they never released them to us in digital format. Yeah. And when I asked for it years ago, they were like, we don't have it. We obviously do. And other test prep companies do as well, because we were able to take paper copies, scan them, and input them.
Right.
But those tests are not part of the new, 101 through 158 lineup. There's also some random things missing. Like, I think it's the first section of LR from PT 92. I can't find it anywhere. I mean, I have PT 92, so it's not a big deal, but it's not in the 101 to 158 that I recall. I'm sure there's some other examples. Now it'll probably come out the next time they release the test, and they'll use that as the experimental. So there's probably a reason, but there's little random things that are around there.
Yeah. Which, if anyone's actually paying attention to this, explains the math of what's occurred. There were 94 before. They cut 20, but that should still leave 74, and yet there's only 58. Why? Again, as we explained, they picked and chose and amalgamated experimental sections from other tests, so those got kind of cannibalized in the process.
Yeah, and I haven't had enough time to really delve into why I think they chose certain tests to cannibalize and not others. So still working on that, but that is exactly right. You went from 94, you didn't release 20, so it should have been 74, but now we've chopped up a bunch of other tests and we're down to 58 total, which is still a significant number of exams. And again, that numbering system changed from 1 to 94 because they already used it. They had to start all over with something new. That's why we got the 101 to 158. It also means that anytime you see a test with 3 numbers, 3 digits, that means that it's not going to have logic games, because they stopped releasing tests once they hit 94 plus, so they never got to 100. And that is a quick way of saying it. A 2-digit test has got logic games on it. A 3-digit test does not.
Yeah, no, that's a handy reference point or shortcut. Smart of you to mention that. So that's it, right?
No, there's more.
Oh. Thank goodness.
To me, the reshuffling of the test was like, irritation. Yeah. That's annoying. That's going to require a lot of renaming work in so many different places across the internet. But the one thing they did do that I am actually a big fan of, and I think will really help, I think everybody going forward, certainly us with the scale predictions that we make, is that when they release these new tests, 101 through 158, they put scoring scales on every single one of them for the 3 scored sections.
Yeah.
And this is useful because it gives you a look at how they think about the way the new test is going to work from a scoring standpoint. And I think that is super helpful. And there's a few things right in there. We're going to dive into this in more detail that will hopefully be more fun than it sounds when we get to it. But the key thing is you see stuff like, hey, there's more questions on these tests than what we've seen with the so-called flex or the recent 3-section test, which means that the scoring scale changes slightly. Mm-hmm. This was, I think, the smartest thing that they did, and the most helpful thing that they did was there's a new scoring scale. Having looked at every single one of them, Jon, which was really at times very interesting and at times incredibly tedious. Stultifying is the word I would use, just mind-numbing.
Yeah.
Because you're going over and you're trying to look at why did they do this? Which test is this? Oh, they removed the logic games from this, and it looked like that scale moved more than I expected it to. I thought there was a lot of interesting facts about it, but it will give us some guidance going forward in terms of how this will work.
Yeah. Well, let's dive into some of the facts and figures of what mostly you have discovered in looking at these things. I've been distracted. But yeah, you've put together what is just a nerd's dream of statistics and things through this. This is, let's just confess, this is a pretty admittedly nerdy episode. We're going to get into the weeds of some of these numbers.
False. That's a lie, and I disagree with you entirely. This is an intelligent test taker's guide to how the scoring scale is going to work coming forward.
There are a lot of things that I think are beneficially useful here, and I realize that's redundant, but let's get into it. So you mentioned that there are going to be more questions per test, which is what happens when you lose games, the shortest section, and replace it with extra logical reasoning, the middle length section. Where are we looking? What's the number?
All right, so let's look at the 58 tests. Just as an aggregate, if you look at the average number of questions, it's 77.65, which tells you that a lot of these tests have 77 or 78 questions that you're floating around. Interestingly, though, that's not the only two kind of like total question results. Two of the tests have 76 questions. 4 of them have 79. So in the 3 sections, what you're seeing is that kind of addition of extra questions over, 26 LR, 27 in terms of reading comp. Every once in a while, you get a lineup that has extra questions across the board, and it pops up to 79. So as people are looking and they're taking their tests, especially on the actual test day, one of the things you want to walk out with is how many questions did I have in each section? Because you'll want to know the scales look different for a 76 question test as they do for a 79 question test.
Yep.
Now, that said, the two most common are 77 and 78. There were 20 of those tests had 77 questions. 32 of them had 78. So more than half the exams that we saw them release have 78 questions. That's probably going to be the standard that we see.
I think so,
and
too.
Occasionally there'll be a deviation from it.
Yeah. Well, we advise this every time, and you just kind of referenced it. I'll advocate it once more, which is when you get out of the test, write down everything you can remember from topic to section order to everything, because some people are now going to have 3 logical reasoning sections, which means question counts are even less useful than they used to be, and they've always been pretty useless. So if you're going off question count, section order, that is going to be deceptively useless, I think.
Agreed. But the more you know walking out of your test about what you just sat through, the better off you're going to be. Yeah. Take notes and then mentally make notes and then essentially regurgitate them afterwards and put them down for your own use. We're not asking you to share them. What we're saying is later on when you're trying to figure out what the experimental section is or what your estimation of difficulty or scaling might be, that will make a huge difference. The number one complaint I see after every single test when I talk to people is, I don't remember. I wish I'd written it down. And I'm like, I've been preaching this for a while. You need to come to LSAT church more often.
And the number one place I hear that complaint, that sort of like lamentation, like I said, just avoid logical reasoning. So never before has it been more important to try to get some topics established.
Well, I'm going to tell you, figuring things out on the new test format is going to be brutal.
It's going to be rough.
Somebody with 3 LRs, the memory challenges there, I don't care who you are going to be considerable. Anyway, let's look at some of this scoring, because I think that's where people really are very interested in. And we'll start at the top, just like we always do. And how many questions you can miss to get a 180. The average, by the way, is 1.22 questions. Now, obviously, no test has 1.22. It's either 1 or 2. Right. But when you look out there, if you miss 0 questions on any LSAT, you get a 180. If you miss 1 question on any LSAT at all of these, you get a 180. So that's the 45 of them, though. Stop right there. You miss one question on 45 of these tests, you've got a 180. But then if you miss 2 questions on those 45 tests, it drops you down. But 13 of those tests allow you to miss 2 questions and still have a 180. So that's kind of useful. That tells you, if you are a test taker, that if you want a 180, you have 1 miss maximum that will guarantee you a 180. If you miss 2 questions, you might have a chance at a 180, but it's not really going to be the case. It's only about a 1 in 4 chance. And I will tell you this, if you miss 3 questions on any of these tests, you will not get a 180. There is no scale that allows you 3 misses to get a 180 here.
Yeah, so think about that. If you're aiming for perfection, you got 2 mistakes tops. That's, it's tight, but that's what perfection should demand, so I'm not upset about it. Let's go down to the next, let's go down 10. Let's talk about a 170, because this has changed a little bit, and for the things that you and I do, I think this is going to be informative.
Yeah, the average number of questions you can miss for a 170 is 8.34. So really very close to 8 on a lot of these tests, which, in the past, I think we would have said it was more along the lines of 7.
Yep.
So some people might say, well, you guys were wrong. You said it was 7 before, now it's 8. No, we weren't wrong. This test has more questions than the older tests. You've lost a 23 question section typically, and you're replacing it with something that's typically 25 or 26 questions.
Yeah.
So that's what the difference is. And we'll talk about the repercussions of that in just a moment. But if you look at how it slates out overall, the kind of like the plurality of tests, the greatest number of tests have 8 that you can miss. So that is probably going to be our new kind of like standard designation. But let's just look at the various numbers of possible questions you could miss to get a 170. If you miss 5 questions, you always are going to basically have a 170 or higher. So if you're like, I want to guarantee myself a score in the 170s, you need to say 5 is the maximum I'm going to allow myself to miss. There's one test where if you miss 6 questions, you get a 170. There are 6 tests where if you miss 7 questions, you get a 170. Then we get to the 8 missed, which is a lot of them. That's 21. But there are now, you can see how it pushes it up a little bit. There's actually 14 tests that you can miss 9 questions on and get a 170. So a loosening scale. And then this is really interesting to me. There were 5 tests they released where you could miss 10 questions and you get a 170.
Yeah, but let me put this in perspective for people who are just this avalanche of numbers. They've added on average about 2.5 questions to the LSAT. They've loosened the scale to compensate for that by about a half a question. That's my quick mental math on this, but
half or maybe 1 at most, but yes.
At most 1. So yeah, the fact that they've replaced games with logical reasoning, the scaling to me says they're not as equivalent as LSAT would like to claim.
Oh, I don't think they're equivalent tests at all, but that's a conversation that on one of these days we'll have about the loss of logic games and predictive validity. That will be the nerd conversation. Yeah, this probably is not.
Let's have it just numbers. When my dry February ends, let's have that conversation because I'm going to need a drink at time.
That's a whole other conversation. My belief very strongly is based upon reading a lot of their reports from the past. A lot of their reports from the past are very definitive that logic games is an important part of the predictive validity of this exam, and that losing it is an issue, and that if you could just double logical reasoning and make it work, this is something they would have done in the past. I don't love what I'm seeing with some things, and we're not done with this, so we'll get a little bit further in there. But just to finish off this conversation with a number of questions, if you're going to get a score in the 170s, if you miss more than 10 questions, there is no test where 11 misses gives you a score in the 170s. You've got to be within 10, and really, to guarantee it, you've got to be 6 or less.
Yeah.
So if you're, say, missing 7, 8, or 9, you've got a decent shot at getting a 170. It's just really going to depend upon the exact scaling for your exam.
Yeah. So in summation, you can't miss 3 for a 180. You can't miss 11 for 170. So those are your constraints.
Yeah. And you see that 9 and 10 misses, 8, 9, and 10 really appear a lot on this because, as we said before, there's more questions. They've loosened it a little bit. Jon, when we start doing reviews in August for the recap of the August test and we make scale predictions, we'll probably start with a baseline of you can miss 8 at that point.
I think so too.
And then say, all right, how hard was this? And we'll probably level our assessments of difficulty a notch higher. We'll have to be even harder to move it at that point, because the majority of scales, plurality really, is 8 here. Yeah. And 8 and 9 together is the majority. So I think we'll probably be a little bit more careful, and you'll see a little bit less latitude in terms of that happening. For April and June, though, we will continue to start at 7, and that is because we have fewer questions and logic games in there. So won't affect anybody in April and June, but in August, we'll probably go through this discussion again and say, this is why we're doing this.
Yeah, we may have to revisit this and explain again. The other thing that happens, and we've covered this before, Dave, is when they reduced the section count from 4 to 3 scored, and the question count obviously as a result, it reduced the number of possible landing points to get you into the 170s and down lower in the scale as well. So every scale here is missing some scores in the 170s. Do you want to touch on that?
Yeah, I want to explain that too, because when you say missing scores, it's like, well, what do you mean?
Right.
If you go look at certain scales, scores won't appear. Like you can't get a 179 or you can't get a 173. They just skip over it. You go from 175 down to 173, for example. This has always been a feature of LSAT. Some of them have 0, some of them had, 1, 2, or 3 examples, and it always occurred at the two ends. It was either in the 120s or it was in the 170s typically. It was rarely outside of those ranges. And so one of the things I was very interested in is if you have fewer questions overall, and now we have a lot of examples, 58 examples, how many scores will be missing? And I focus on the 170s, not the 120s, because our goal is always, if we come in working with somebody who's in the 120s, to get them out of there as fast as possible. So we're not going to dwell on that. But every one of these scales, there's at least 2 unachievable scores in the 170s. So that's the first thing. That's how they, there's less separation on this test.
Exactly.
Before you had LSATs with 100, 101, maybe 102 questions, you can separate people better than if you have 76, 77, 78 questions. There's still the same 61 scores that are in there, but having fewer questions doesn't allow you as much separation. And so what LSAC has done is literally take away some possible scores.
Yeah.
I wonder if what they should have done here is change the entire scoring scale.
I've been thinking about that for a long time, especially knowing this adjustment was coming. Just revamp it. You don't have to stick to this 120 to 180 thing. There are way more sensible ways to separate people, especially at the high end where it kind of matters most in many ways. So yeah, there are scores that you simply can't achieve. And if someone listening to this still doesn't know what we mean, there are tests where you can't get a 175, for instance. There are other tests where you can't get a 178. But the problem with trying to score really highly on this test is there are some tests where you can't get 5 of those top 11 scores.
Let's get to that.
Okay.
So every test out there is missing at least 2 scores in the 170s. And I count that from 170 to 180. So it's 11 scores there.
Yeah.
That's 14 of them have just 2 misses. That's just fine. Oddly enough, the very first 2, 101 and 102, are both at the 2 miss. And a lot of the ones at the end are at the 2 miss as well. The ones that have more misses are all, I'm not going to say hidden or secreted in the middle of the numbers, but they're not at the endpoints where people usually look at the first 2 and say, oh, what do they look like? Or they're doing recent tests. Right. And so they see those. The most normal separation is at the endpoints. 29 of the tests that are missing 3 scores.
Yes.
13 of the tests are missing 4 of the possible scores. And 2 of the exams have 5 different scores missing between 170 and 180. It's PT 121 and 123. And I'll say this now and I'll say it again. Go look at PT 121, the scoring scale. It's weird. It doesn't look right to me. But between 170 and 180, there are 11 scores. On those 2 tests, 121 and 123, 5 of them are unachievable. I'm telling you, from a psychometric standpoint, I have serious questions that I wouldn't mind asking them in terms of justifying how you can talk about the differences between certain scores when only 5 or 6 of the 11 scores are possible.
I think we can both agree almost objectively that keeping the scoring scale the same as it used to be with 100, 101 question test, when now it's 78, as we've talked about, it has made this test less reliable, or at least less representative of what you're trying to measure. It's a worse test, frankly.
Yeah, and if LSAC was here, they'd be like, no, that's not the case. We have the research. I'm like, oh, fantastic. I'm so glad to hear that. I'm glad you've done the research. I expected you had. Release it. It's a simple call. If you want to come dispute my claim, release the actual data that disproves it, because I'm seeing things that have been really problematic with the LSAT since we hit the pandemic. That flex test and the scoring bubble that they first denied and then turned out to be outrageous. Even the creep of percentiles, I've been looking at that inside these tests and how they've slowly been going up, and how scores across the board are lower percentiles than they were 10, 20 years ago. We can go on between the flex, the at-home stuff.
Yeah.
You know, I can go off further.
The level of restraint from the both of us right now is palpable.
I've got real questions.
I'm proud of us.
Anyway, you know, the bottom line there is that everyone still is being forced to take the LSAT. Law schools are still using it, and test optional, which was really in vogue for a while. If you look at the undergrad, the SAT stuff, you see schools like MIT and Dartmouth and so forth saying we're going to use the LSAT or the SAT again. It's almost like the pendulum is swinging back. So I point this out to tell people that it means that your scoring scale is going to make a big impact on your score ultimately. Mm-hmm. It always is the case, but even more so, it seems more variable from the examples they provided than it did in the past. And so, yes, it always has a big impact. What I'm saying is it may have an even greater randomized aspect to it. You get one of these tests missing 5 scores, you could really be benefited or hurt. Mm-hmm. And I'll come back to that because I'm gonna hit back on the PT 121 again in a moment. But let's just finish off the scoring scale breakdown.
Yeah, I was about to say the same thing. You used the word creep a second ago. If I was still in Napa, you'd have just pointed at me. But let's move our way down the scale a little bit. Let's go like 160s down. Let's go to 150 all the way down.
Yeah, just let's do the averages. I don't want to go through the deep analysis of this, but average number of questions missed for a 165, 13.38. Mm-hmm. So you missed 13 questions on the typical LSAT scale. They release 165. 160 is 19.52. So around 19 questions typically gets you a 160. Dropping down to 150, it's usually about 33 and a third questions that you can miss. So you miss 33 on one of these tests, which is like 44 right, 45 right. You end up with a 150 on these exams. So
these scales feel tighter to me than they've been.
They're not.
I need to do like an actual A to B thing, but they feel a little bit tighter in terms of what's changed. I think they are.
This is what I was saying before is I haven't done the full scale comparison of these new scales to some of the old ones that are out there. If you go into the file that we have where every damn score is listed and the number you can miss to get that and the number you have to get correct and so forth, those tests haven't been added into it. We will, and we'll be able to look a little bit more deeply at it, as well as the conversion scales from the 4-section test when they had average of 101 questions that are out there. But if you're looking at a nice baseline, you know that if you miss about 33 questions, you'd be getting a 150.
Right.
You miss around 19 questions, you're probably getting a 160. You miss 13 questions, you're right in that 165 area.
Yeah.
You can kind of just, work your way up from there and figure out what it takes. You miss around 8 questions, it's a 170. You miss a question, you're at a 180. So at least gives people the idea of, on a broad overview, how do these look?
Yeah.
But like I said, some of these tests are weird, John. On 2 of the tests, 105 and 121, the scaling is just abnormal in the extreme. That's why I said go look at 121. You can miss on these two tests a one question and you get a 180. But both of them have removed 178 and 179. And so the next score down is 177. You miss another question and you get a 177. So one miss is 180. Two misses is a 177. And on both of those tests, you miss a third question and it gets you a 175.
Yeah. So we're talking two weirdo tests where three misses is a 175. And yet there's an entire host of tests where three misses is a 179. Think about forever, basically, how people have interpreted law school's interpretation of that difference, that disparity, a 175, a 179. I've seen people retake a 175. I don't advise it. But the fact that you can miss
three.
Yeah, the fact that you can miss the same number of questions on just two different tests, and that's going to be the difference in a 175 and a 179. That's wild.
Now, before everybody, is like unfairness, and I don't love this kind of scale discrepancy on that.
Yeah.
The argument that would come back is, hey, at the upper levels, that test where you miss three and you get a 175, there's not as many super difficult questions. Whereas on the other tests that are looser, they have more high level, high difficulty questions. And that's the difference. This is the classic. The harder the test, the looser the scale, the easier the test from a logical standpoint, the tighter the scale. So there would be a counter argument against this. I'm just saying, when I looked at those tests and I saw that missing one was 180, missing two was 177, I cursed aloud. I was like, this is a host of words.
Yeah.
And so
I wanted to see if you're actually going to do it.
Yeah. On one of those tests, 178, 179 is gone. And then like 176 is gone. And I'm like, well, you go right to 175. That's painful for me from a student standpoint. I have empathy there.
Yeah. So to take this from sort of observational to pragmatic, I would avoid PT 121 just as a test taker. I think it's such an outlier in terms of what clearly is a lack of difficulty. That to me would not be something to prioritize.
Yeah, that PT 121, like I said, go look at the scale. There's actually an LSAC site called Zendesk where they use the Zendesk platform to deliver this. You can go look at the scoring scale for 121. It's not just that 3 gets you a 175. You can only miss 6. It's one of those tests to get a 170.
Yeah.
It is tight. That is also, by the way, PT 48 overall. So they're saying, hey, there's just not many hard questions on this. So if you really want to go get a bunch right, that would be the test to take.
Yeah. And again, to walk this back to some fundamentals, when you can miss fewer questions to hit a certain scoring outcome, it means that test on the whole was easier for people. When they allow you to miss more questions, it means clearly there was a greater degree of difficulty. So only missing 6 for 170, only missing 3 for 175. That test is abnormal.
Yeah, it means you can't make mistakes. You got to be good. You can't have a lapse of focus or judgment for even a moment. Let's jump off the scoring scale for a second and talk just a little bit about how these tests were constructed so that people could see inside that. More generalized facts and figures about the way the exams play out. First off, we know they added an experimental to all 58 of these tests that they drew from other exams. Jon, 38 of those were LR experimentals. 20 of them were RC experimentals. So about in the kind of ratio of the 2 scored LR to 1 scored RC. So that made sense. Yeah,
it's about 2 to 1. So let's talk about what that then looks like in terms of test composition. Of the 58 tests that they've now provided in the hundreds, 38 of those have 3 logical reasoning sections and 1 RC. Only 20 have double of both, 2 LRs and 2 RCs.
Yeah, and I can't tell which is the most nightmarish scenario, 3 LRs or 2 RCs. I'm like, they both suck. This is why I like logic games.
It's 2 RCs.
You're right about that.
Yeah,
but
full stop.
I will say this, 3 LRs means that you are spending a lot of time moving quickly from one idea to the next. I like RC for myself because sometimes I can take like a moment and be like, I'm not totally focused, but I'm still in one of the 4 passages. And so I don't lose, complete kind of like the position that I'm in. I can get right back to it. In LR, you don't get that luxury. You lose focus on one question and then you're on to another question thereafter. You don't get an opportunity to self-correct.
Yeah. LR really is like Frogger or something where you're just constantly one to the next, lily pads. I think I just dated myself a bit with a Frogger reference.
Yes, you did. It's unfortunate. I've never even heard of that game. Anyway, the experimental placement. The experimental placement is pretty even across the 4 sections. 12 of the tests have it first.
Yeah.
14 of the tests have the experimental second. 17 have it third, and 15 have it in 4th position. And so what LSAC is indicating is it could be anywhere. Mm-hmm. Don't think just because you're on section 4 that it's real. It could be experimental, and section 1 could be experimental. So just something to be aware of, that they only have 4 options. They're going to use all of them in equal amounts.
From someone who wants this test to be as equitable and fair and predictive as possible, that is how you should do it. It should be roughly distributed about the same to each section. That's what they've done.
Yeah.
I know you know.
I'm not going to argue. I mean, yeah.
I think I'm biting tongue might be bleeding from.
I honestly think that you have experimental first or 4th. You compared 2 test takers with identical content. I think one of those people has just gotten a great advantage, and that's the experimental 4th person, because when they are the most fatigued, it doesn't count. The other person who has experimental in the 1st position, they rolled in ready to go. They spent a lot of energy initially, and it didn't count. I would love to see, I know LSAC has told me the positioning of the experimental doesn't matter. And that's one of those grain of salt proclamations to me where I'm like, I must take it with a grain of salt, because I don't have the evidence to dispute it other than understanding human nature and thinking, boy, that doesn't make sense to me. But they have claimed repeatedly to me that the position of the experimental has no impact on scores as far as they can tell.
Well, I'm going to agree with you 100%, but I'm going to put an asterisk on that, which is to say that sometimes the experimental in the 1st section is the best thing that can happen, because that's probably when you're most nervous. You're trying to kind of find your footing, get some momentum built up, maybe build some confidence. Yeah. If things go a little crooked right away, there is hope that it didn't matter. So
that's the counter argument.
Yeah. I find myself as I go through this test getting faster, getting more comfortable, getting more kind of like acclimated. It takes me a minute to focus in. So to me, if I had to pick a section for an experimental, it wouldn't be 4th. It'd be 1st.
Yeah, you see, this is the difference between me and you. You are always late to the airport when a plane is taking off, whereas I am either on time or slightly early. So it's just a matter of personality.
I have no rebuttal.
No, you don't, because you know it's true.
Yeah, too sure.
All right, we're almost out of this episode here. At least out of those 58 tests, interestingly enough, 33 of them start with LR, 25 start with RC, which seems a bit high overall, because you expect there to be more LRs, and there are, but not by as much as we would have expected. But it's really only 4 sections, and they don't have that many options, so it's not all that high. Probably, though, if you think about the way these exams work, it means that when you go to take that August LSAT, it's no guarantee that LR will be first by any means. There's plenty of RC first tests that they've released here, but is a greater than 50% chance that you will see LR first in these exams.
Yes. But not the same percent chance that you'll see experimental LR, which is a higher percentage. So it's interesting. When RC is the experimental choice, which again is only about 33% roughly, it's more likely to be first.
Yeah, it's there's just so much, at a certain point, it's like how much data helps and how much hurts. If I tell students, hey, probably LR, but it could be RC, you can, with only 2 sections, you should be able to handle either one of them out of the gate. And whether or not it's scored should not be something that really matters to any test takers. You just go do the test.
Yeah. One of the things you and I talk a lot about in our test mentality discussions is this idea of like, you need to have a game plan for the unpredictability of this test. You've written an incredible blog article about the LSAT casino, as you cleverly call it. But that casino just shrunk a little bit. The roulette wheel of the LSAT now truly only has 2 colors. So you don't have to go into it being like, all right, I've got 3 things to maybe prepare my mind for. Now there's just 2. There's only 2 possibilities of what happens to you.
Yeah.
I like that for test takers in many ways. So there are positives to all of this. Personally, we just lost my favorite section, so I'm still a little salty.
You and me both. Anyway, moving on to kind of like the last point that I'll make about this. It is interesting when you kind of look at the tests, whether or not you have 2 RC and 2 LR, so an experimental RC, or whether you have 3 LR and an RC. I can't tell whether this is an actual rule that they'll have going forward, but comparing those 2 tests, they have at least kind of like opened up this kind of idea where if you have the 2 RCs, you won't open or close with a double set. They won't divide the test into 50-50. You won't have 2 RCs and then 2 LRs as your test. You also won't have 2 LRs and 2 RCs. It's almost like they don't want people to get into a groove, do both the RCs back to back, then do both the LRs back to back and get comfortable. They want to break it up. So they never allow an open or close with 2 RCs. They do allow it in sections 2 and 3. So then you'd have LR, RC, RC, LR. So it's almost like that's broken up enough that they feel like they don't want to have blocks of sections. They didn't hold to that same kind of breaking it up rule in LR. There are multiple tests that open or close with 3 LR sections in a row, meaning you might have a test that starts with RC and then 3 LRs, or you might have 3 LRs to open the test and close with RC. So something about 2 LRs in a row in the first and second or third and fourth positions was a problem for them, at least on what they released. But it wasn't if it was in second or third. They were okay with that. But 3 LRs, screw you, man. We're okay with that. 75 plus LRs right in a row there. We're okay with it.
Again, to the listener, where I find this to be instructive is I think my instinct with some of this would be if I had an RC section first, I'd be like, that's probably what my experimental is going to be then. Not that section necessarily, but that section type.
Yeah.
And yet they are totally willing to just run the rest of your day out with logical reasoning.
Yeah, and I think some of those analyses, statistically will have that information or like, according to what they released, this was the probability. Now, whether or not the past is prologue for what they do in the future, we won't know until we get to August and we start seeing people saying, I had 1 RC and it was first, or I had 1 RC and it was last, that kind of stuff. And then we can start to take a look at the statistical likelihood of these various things occurring. But
well, you have to think, Dave. I mean, they had total license to remake these tests however they wanted. I have to believe, given what their intentions are, that they've remade them in a way that's going to be representative of what comes in August and beyond. Like if
one hopes so.
Yeah, one does hope, including I think them. They should hope. So the fact that they are willing to do an RC and then 3 LRs following it, I see no reason to think that that's not some sort of forebear.
Yes, I think it's possible, and I think it will happen. The question that I really am interested in is how often will it happen? How frequently will something like that occur? And that's what we don't know yet. We'll see it. I can look at what they've done so far and say, here's the likelihood of it. I just don't know if that's going to 100% hold going forward. They've made claims that it's the same test, everything's identical, LR topics are the same. When you re-release all your information, it's easy to say, no, it's totally the same. See?
Sure.
Release some new sections after you get this test underway and let me take a look at those. Then we'll know. As we've said, John, experimental reports seem to have a greater degree of emphasis on things like formal logic, more advanced conditional reasoning, a lot of numbers and percentages stuff. And LSAC went on to Reddit and actually said, no, this is just the same type of questions, same type of concepts we've seen before. And of course, that's true. I've pointed examples. I wrote a blog about what will LR look like on the August 2024, and I pointed to released questions from the past that are in this vein. No one's saying that it's a new concept for the LSAT. What we're saying is, might it be that you emphasize it more now that you've lost logic games and some of these ideas are logic gamey a little bit?
Yeah, and it really only takes like 2 instances a section to make that kind of difference. But that was just 2. Well, we've seen how much of a difference 2 questions can make. So, yeah. August and September are going to be fascinating. That might be my favorite crystal ball, just in anticipation of it, that you and I have done in years. Because the entire nature of what we predict is going to change. And this is going to be one of those predictions where it truly is like a feel. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like intuition is going to play a lot more into that than data.
Yeah, the LSAC has made a number of proclamations to the effect of, hey, the test is exactly the same. LR is going to be the same. We're just, shuffling out games for a new LR. And if that is the case, obviously that keeps things at least as clear as possible from a preparation standpoint. But like I said, they also told me there was no score bubble. I got that straight from the very top, the CEO of LSAC. No, there's no scoring bubble. Why do you think that? I'm like, because I'm looking at the data.
Because I can read percentages.
I could tell you the exact time, day, and place where I had that conversation with her.
I can too, actually. It was Christmas Day.
Thanksgiving morning of all days.
Oh, damn it.
Several years ago, I was like, wow, we're having a funny conversation on Thanksgiving. I didn't expect to be working today. But that, and I think at that point we had differing viewpoints. They didn't think there was a score bubble. We did. Eventually it was clear there was a score bubble. I think they thought that things would change and they didn't. So I'm willing to grant them, some kind of like reasonable excuse for why they had that particular viewpoint, even though the stats were really trending heavily towards that. I could certainly understand them saying right now, we intend to make this the same. But you're losing logic games, which was conceptually not the same as logical reasoning, and it had valid contributions to the utility of this test. I could see them wanting to bring that back in there. This is why we talk about the devil you know. Like the LSAT today is the devil you know. We don't know about August and after. That could be a very different type of thing. So that circles back, John, to the whole conversation of if you're good or comfortable with logic games, take April or June. And probably the last thing, and then I think we'll probably wrap this one up. People have asked, are you going to post these tests?
Yes.
Yes, definitely. First off, the current courses already have content with logic games removed. So you can go in and take tests that are in the new August 2024 test format. These new 101 to 158 tests, kind of like the reshuffled. One of the things that's happening here, John, that some people know, but not a lot, is that in April, we are launching a whole new suite of courses. We've completely rebuilt the on-demand and the live online courses, even to the extent that the names will change. So if you're taking that August test or later, we have new courses coming down the pipeline here that will launch with these tests as kind of like the main feature set. And again, it's a reshuffling, so it's not new content. You have it if you're in a current course or if you're taking the April, June, kind of like what we call the legacy format.
Yeah.
But you'll have these new tests as well going forward. So it's all covered one way or the other.
That's exciting. I'm actually looking forward to April because especially those live online courses that are coming out, they're going to be incredible. They're going to be so interactive. They're going to keep you busy. Not you specifically, but you, listener. You're
going to keep me busy too.
Keep us both very busy. But yeah, there's going to be stuff to do every single day, all day. It's going to be very cool. So
yeah, it is a totally new model.
If you're willing to work, join us in April. But there's no reason not to start now, frankly, because like you say, everything that we're doing at present is also kind of geared with the future in mind. We're future-proofing the current.
Yeah, the current courses will suffice for any of the tests. April, June, August, it doesn't matter. And that's because RC and LR are on all these tests. One of them, you just study logic games. The other, you don't study logic games. But we are shuffling all of that up coming here in April. And I know we'll do a podcast probably at the beginning of April where we talk about exactly how it will be different. You and I, you in particular, have taught a number of the on-demand classes.
Yeah, I have.
So it is going to be direct instruction from us. And we'll be teaching, some of the classes that are ongoing as well once that all gets underway. But more to come on that.
Sure.
Any last comments about all this new stuff they just released, John?
My only thought here is that I need to spend more time with it because as deep a dive as this certainly was, I'm pretty sure we can dive deeper. There's still so many things to unravel about this. This is an LSAT onion. And I'm looking forward to getting deeper into it. Doesn't mean we'll necessarily have another episode, but it's certainly going to inform some choices and advice that we provide going forward. So if anyone has made it this far, congratulations.
Yes, congratulations. And the other thing I would say is that this is just the first slice that we take on this.
Yeah.
And it helps us understand the type of predictions that we'll make for scales going forward, which we want to be accurate on. We will do a considerable amount of more work before August in order to try to be as accurate as possible. Jon, we've always either hit it on the nose or been within one with rare exception, and I want to continue that going forward. And I think this will help us do that.
Yeah,
so
I think that's
I'm happy about them doing this.
Commendable ambition. Last question for you, is there anything now that they've peeled the curtain back a little bit that you think we've gotten wrong enough to apologize for? Like where we could be like, this whole time we were thinking 7 as a baseline, it should have been 6. This whole time we thought.
No.
Yeah, okay, good. Because I haven't seen anything like that either. In fact, if anything, it makes my stance on what we've done firmer. Yeah,
starting in August, we'll start at 8. On rare occasion, we'll say that something loosens it. That's going to be once in a blue moon. And then with slightly higher degrees of frequency, we'll say this is, or rather tighten it. And then occasionally we'll say this will loosen it.
Yeah.
So a lot of those scales will be 8 or 9, occasionally a 10. Only rarely do I think we'll come out and say this is a -7 scale on that test. It's going to require a certain very unusual lineup for that to happen.
Yeah, I look forward to the unusual. PT 121 now, for instance, is a good example where I'm like, I got to check this thing out. But I think,
You won't like it. What's weird is that test, by the way, so odd at the top. By the time it hits 150, it's back to pretty much normal.
Yeah.
Again, they're saying the mid-level questions are normal. And like any LSAT, it's the high-level questions that are missing on that test. But I'll let anybody who has the time and the interest go research it on their own, including you.
Thank you. Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts, but I'm also deliriously exhausted. So I'll save those thoughts for another day.
And on that note, if you get a chance, please subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or anywhere else that you may find it. And if you've enjoyed it, leave us a comment and a rating as well. And if you have any questions, please send those to lsatpodcast@powerscore.com. On behalf of Jon and myself, have a great week. We will talk to you soon.